Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I think it's finally time to recreate a battle that's been raging for generations. Coke versus Pepsi. Now my plan was to use a Coke can and a Pepsi can to create my mighty battle bots, but in a shocking twist, this Pepsi can is actually a Coke can in disguise. Not to worry, I'm going to be painting these anyway, so I'll scuff up the surface with some sandpaper to help future paint adhere, and it's time to plan my battle can designs. And honestly, I'm at a bit of a loss as to what to do. If only there was an easy to understand random robot design generator that I could roll dice against to help me build a big bot. Well, what's this? To Adam from Billy. Why, it's none other than a cropped and properly sized printout of the junk bot generator from Bill Making Stuff. This handy little sheet will allow me to roll a 20-sided dice for each body part of my bot, allowing me to create a unique and a flavorful design without the stress of having to think for myself. And if there's one thing I can't abide on this channel, it's thinking for myself. Of course, I'll need to roll the dice twice since I'll have a Coke bot and a Pepsi bot, but otherwise all I need to do is roll some internet dice and highlight the appropriate description for each body part. I'll roll for the head, arms, hands, legs, and flavor, then I can repeat all of this again for the blue battle bot, and after totally legit and not at all re-rolled rolling of dice, I'm left with a Coke bot that will be a leaking, cyclopean, multi-armed, buzzsaw-handed, quadrupedal, asymmetrical bot, and a Pepsi bot that will be a heavy-smoking, jawed, pistoned, biggened, tracked, rusty bot. So with my freshly sanded cans, I can begin the embottoning, starting with Cokebot. Now first things first, I'll pop the pop top off the pop can bot's top and crinkle the can so it's a little more well-worn since I want these to be proper battle bots in the midst of doing battle. Then to make Cokebot's quadrupedal legs, I poked a couple holes on each side of the can's bottom so I can fit these awkwardly bent armature wires into them, adding a little tape to help them hold their shape. Then once I've bent the bot legs into an appropriate quadruped pose, I can start adding clay around the base of each leg as well as along the bit of exposed armature wire to hide the unsightly holes and to make the legs look like they might be able to swivel around on ball joints. I'll then square off the most distal part of each leg by adding a little clay and cutting away the excess to create a nice smooth-ish surface that I can comfortably sand flat before coming back and wrapping each knee joint with some teeny tiny wire to create cables and wires hanging down from each leg in a sort of haphazard way. I'll then cover the end of each cable with that aforementioned ball joint before adding little discs to each of the knees and little pre-baked balls to the feet so that I can press the legs onto some teeny tiny robo feet. I like the idea of little wimpy legs on a murder bot, so I'm going to try and keep them as flimsy looking as possible. To make Cokebot's multiple buzzsaw-handed arms, I'll poke some more holes in the can so I can fit a handful of arms scattered around the body to appeal to the asymmetrical flavor that the junk bot generator demanded. Much like the legs, I'll wrap these in more little balls to create additional ball joint connections before realizing that this is going to be hella awkward to build on top of since it's all attached to the can now. So I'll chop the arms off and replace all the pre-attached arms with little discs covering each of the unsightly arm holes, which I can then hollow the centers out of to allow for attachable arms later using these little pre-baked clay balls. I'll drill a hole in the tip of the ball, then glue my arm in place, and now I can build my arms separately and attach them later at whatever angle I want. For now though, let's finish this body. I'll start at the top this time by taking a half ball of aluminium foil and wrapping it in some clay to create an R2-D2-esque dome that I'll carve a little detail into before baking it so I can sand the hell out of it to ensure that it's nice and smooth. Once I've got a nice smooth elongated robo dome, I can start adding a bit of detail like panels and more panels to one side since again I need it to be asymmetrical before taking a thick clay sausage and cutting it at a curved angle so I can fit it onto the other side of the dome to create the singular ocular viewport, thereby adding the necessary cyclopean detail. A quick test fit to make sure the head still fits, then it's back down to the legs where I'll add a last bit of detail by filling in the exposed knees and drilling some little holes so I can mount some roll bars to the side of the legs and along the body, as well as some more much needed paneling along the legs and atop the knees and haphazardly strewn about the body of the can. With that though, this body is all but built. So it's time to finally finish the arms, starting by building some buzzsaw blades. To build my buzzsaw blades, I'll start with a thin sheet of clay that I can cut a series of variously sized circles out of, then bake them so I can sand away any bubbles or bumps before trimming the edges into slightly sharper shapes before beginning the process of cutting little triangles into the edges to make the buzzsaw blade teeth. I'll then glue some little plastic washers onto the centers of the saw blade, which will both add a bit of detail as well as make it so I can't safely put it in the oven, which I guess means I need to build the rest of the arm without the blade attached. Before I remove the blade though, I'll bend the arm at an appropriate angle, then I can start to add all the detail. Mostly this just involves adding bits and bobs, baking each layer so I can add another layer on top until I've built up my buzzsaw-less arm into what I imagined a big Coca-Cola fueled murder bot would have as a means to fight for dominancy in a far-flung future controlled by massive robo-powered soda pop conglomerates. Once that's done, I can reattach the blade, set the arm aside, then repeat this process 5 more times to create the rest of Cokebot's buzzsaw-handed arms. Then I can bring Cokebot's body back into the fray and begin attaching my arms, which works well enough with a little dab of CA glue since they're really not carrying much weight anyways. Otherwise, once I've got all the arms in place, I can set Cokebot aside for now and get started making his arch nemesis, Pepsi Bot. Now, despite the similarity of the sugar-infused syrupy liquid powering both bots, the design of them couldn't be less similar. Well, apart from them being built on a can as the central point, but that doesn't count. While the Coca-Cola company opted for a quadrupedal multi-armed sawmill, PepsiCo went with a more traditional tank design, opting for death from afar rather than melee superiority. With that in mind, we rolled tank tracks for Pepsi Bot's legs, which means I'm going to need to make some tank treads, which I'll do by making a series of circles layered on circles to create the gears of the treads. Then once they've been baked, I can stack them in 2s and saw little spokes into each gear to make them look a little bit more like gears. Otherwise, with my gears almost looking like gears, I can begin arranging them into a tank tread-like arrangement, drilling holes and running armature wire to connect the bottom ones, and using a little CA glue to attach the ones on top. Finally, for a little extra support, I'll wrap some cotton string around the center, then lock it all in place with a bit more glue. With the gears of the tread done, I just need to make the treads themselves, which I can do by taking a long flat sheet of clay and adding little indents all the way along, then cutting it down to size and wrapping it around the wheels. A quick bake will lock the tread in place, and I can repeat this process to get a second set of treads. And that's Pepsi Bot's tank treads done and ready for the can. I'll flip the can over and scratch the base with a knife and drip a little CA glue onto the can so I can press some clay down to lock it in place. I'll then drill some matching holes into the centers of the gears, then fit a wire across connecting both treads so I can press the bottom clay down onto the wire before pulling one of the treads off so I can attach a second wire to give the can a bit more support. A single support wire would allow the can to sort of tilt back and forth, so a second angled one will keep it firmly locked in place. With that though, Pepsi Bot is hella supported from the bottom up, so I can add some clay around the base, covering all the wire and creating a more robotic looking base to the base of the robot, before sticking lots of little wires into the bottom, which will act as some low hanging cables and wiring. Next up, I need to figure out how to give this thing a jaw while still retaining the robo-tank look I'm aiming for. I think I might be able to give a fake jaw by adding some spooky metal teeth to the front of the robot rather than giving it a proper head, since I want the top of the tank to be a cannon. So for a little toothy flavoring, I'm gonna dip into the world of Warhammer and add a big orc jaw to the middle of my can. I considered adding the top of the jaw, but it looked a little too goofy and it would have covered up any future branding, so I opted to remove it in the end. Before I baked the jaw though, I wanted to give the treads a bit more texture, so I'll stipple lots of a bacon bond onto the top, then add strips of alternating length to each of the treads before rolling the knurled grip of a pen vise over the surface to finish it off. Then, once it's been baked, I can pop the jaw off and set it aside while I get to work making my hands. Or, perhaps more accurately, my hand. For the hands, I rolled a 10, which is written as biggin, but I read it as big gun, so instead of one big hand, I'm gonna make one big gun. I'll start by wrapping this compacted piece of aluminium foil in some clay before cutting a little hole in the front and doing my damnedest to get it as flat and sharp-edged as I possibly can so as to minimize the amount of sanding I'll need to do to get it perfectly flat. Once properly flattened, I can drill a big hole in the center and fit a short length of dowel into it before wrapping said dowel on a thick layer of clay and sanding that nice and flat as well. I'll add a knob to the tip of my can and then cut it to size and sand it as well, though off camera this time, before attaching some pre-baked supports to the side of the cannon so I can properly position it facing downwards, blasting away at a rival red menace. With the position locked in place, I can start adding the little greebles by way of plenty of clay sheets of varying thicknesses and lengths until my flat gray cannon is a bit more interesting. With the cannon complete, I can get to work turning the body into a heavy smoker, which I figured I could do by adding some great big exhaust ports billowing black tarry air into the ozone. I made a molded back plate that fits perfectly onto the can, then baked it so I can pop it off and drill some holes to fit these lengths of wound wire in place that I can then angle appropriately and wrap in some thin layers of clay. Once they've been wrapped in a thin layer of this stickier Cosclay, I'll cover that layer in a thicker layer of Super Sculpey, which doesn't stick to the wire nearly as easily, but it does tend to leave a smooth, more easily sandable surface. A last bit of super thin clay wrapped around the elbows and the joints, as well as some semi-random sheets for the little bit of added slapped together look, and I can reattach the smokestacks to the back of the bot before adding more little sheets around the body. Finally, before I glue the teeth in place, I want to add some damage to both bots, so I'll line Cokebot's extended blade up with Pepsi Bot's body and mark the angle of the blade, then I'll line the cannon up with Cokebot's chest and punch a hole through Cokebot's front, exploding out its back. I'll bend the metal of the can outwards to enlarge the exit wound, then I'll take a saw and messily hack away a section of Pepsi Bot's body to give me a nice ragged cut where Cokebot's blade is digging in. However, before I can move on to painting, I want to add some final greebles, which means I need to make some nuts and bolts, which I can do with this handy little silicone bolt making mold. This little sheet has bolts of varying sizes, but I really only want the 3 larger sizes, so I'll fill each of the sections with plenty of UV resin, then work my way around with a silicone shaper, pushing the resin into each of the dips, removing any of the air bubbles as I go. Then I can blast it with a UV lamp to cure it before dumping it out into a tray. This then leaves me with a bunch of delightful little bolts ready to be attached. I'll then work my way around both of the bots, adding bolts wherever I think they would fit best. Mostly this is in the corners of any of the larger panels and in the corners of the larger pieces, as well as anywhere else along the arms and legs that they look like they could do with a bit more detail. I'll do the same thing with more of these plastic washers that I used on the buzzsaw blades, since both of these bots have baked their last bake and there's plenty of flat surface in need of random circles. Otherwise, once I've used up the last of my greebles, I can finally hot glue the heads in place, or the head in the cannon since I guess Pepsi Bot doesn't get a head, or pistoned arms since I've just now realized that I totally forgot to add those. But hey, 11 out of 12 ain't bad. With the building done though, it's time to prime these murder bots black, so I can get on to the painting. I'll start by giving both of the bots a full once-over in duraluminum, since that's the closest metallic color I have to the shiny aluminum of a normal soda can, before blasting Cokebot with a red to turn it into the Red Menace, while Pepsi Bot gets a blue base coat to turn it into the Blue Death. Then with the base coats and place coats, I can get to work adding the much-needed branding so you can easily tell each of these combatants apart. I like to freehand where I can, and for some reason my collection of Warhammer stencils doesn't contain any Coke-related logos, so I'll test my sanity by trying to freehand the Coca-Cola logo over a dented and destroyed robo-chassis surrounded by claws, all while trying to keep a fully sized DSLR directly in front of my face. And I think, apart from a bit of a wonky angle, it turned out pretty good. So once I added some Coke-appropriate white wavy lines to the sides, I can move on to the Blue Menace, who gets a much less frustrating Pepsi logo smack dab in the center of the torso. This is a lot easier to do since I haven't written in cursive since middle school, and that was like...
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Well, label a few years ago, so the more straightforward font of Pepsi is a lot more forgiving. With the logos in place, I'll give both bots a once-over and a high-gloss varnish so that the flatter hues are a bit shinier, as I did mix some metallics into the blues and reds, but I think they're still a bit too flat for big metallic soda bots. Otherwise, once the varnish has dried, I'll add a tiny bit of variation by painting some random panels with slightly darker shades of red or slightly lighter shades of blue, depending on the brand color, which is barely noticeable but should help break up a bit of the one-tone monotony. Then I'll work my way around each of the battle bots, cleaning up the overspray on the metallic bits. Same as I did with the reds and blues, I'll add a tiny bit of barely noticeable variation to the shiny bits by adding some differing tones of metallics here and there, as well as picking out all of the bolts with their own unique color so they stand out a bit better. Or not, since I can't actually see the difference now. With that done, I'll work my way around all the colored panels, adding a bit of shading and weathering, starting with a brownish red wash over the Red Menaces panels and a darker blackish blue over the Blue Deaths panels. Finally, I'll add a thin glaze to all of the metal bits with a greasy, oily-looking brown wash to make them all look a little less pristine. To add plenty of battle damage and weathering, I'll work my way around both of the bots, dabbing away with a sponge covered in that original duraluminum, which should look like little paint chips and marks, revealing the underlying soda can beneath. I'll then dry brush some silver over all of the metal bits and along some of the painted sections to highlight the sharper edges, as well as add some last little weathering along the edges. I also decided to paint all the cables black since I didn't want to introduce any other coloring into the design, as I don't imagine Pepsi or Coke would be willing to deviate from their branding in any way. Then I can paint the treads of the tank black, followed by a series of lighter gray dry brushes to pick out all the texture and detail. Now for the flavor of the Blue Death, I rolled a 1, which meant it needed to be hella rusty, so I've got some rust-colored paint that I'll sponge over the surface of the Blue Death, followed by a lighter orange rust I'll add on top of that to create a bit of variation. Last but not least, and not last either, I'll work my way around the bolts, adding streaking grime to all the bolts to make them look extra gnarly and unkempt. The 13th design principle that I decided to add without the help of the Junkbot generator was just add lots and lots of stuff until the viewer is overwhelmed to the point of being unable to notice how wonky and poorly crafted everything else is. I call it rolling a nat 20 on a north of the border savings throw. Or a 1, I guess, if it doesn't work. The Blue Death's treads were a bit boring, so I painted the gears with a gunmetal gray, then dry brushed some lighter metallics over top before deciding that if I ended up building a base, it'll probably be some sort of sandy something, so I mixed up some pigment powders in water and flow improver to create a soupy goopy mess that I'll brush onto the treads and into the gears, which should make it look nice and dusty once it dries. Back to the Red Menace, I realized I forgot to paint its cyclopean eye, so I'll base coat the center in black, then with the help of the airbrush, I'll add a little white dot covered in fluorescent reds and oranges to give it a HAL 9000 glow, before dumping a fair dollop of UV resin over the top so it's nice and shiny. I also figured if the Blue Death is covered in sand, then I should probably sand up the Red Menace's feet as well. Back to the Blue Bot, it's time to make the smokestacks smoke, which I'll do by drilling some little holes into the tops so I can fit these little wires into them that I will then cover in tightly wound, unwound cotton balls. I'll blast the cotton with a heavy dose of black paint so they look ready to destroy the ozone, then I can glue them in place, adding a little bit more cotton around the base of the smokestack and inside the gaping chest wound left by the Red Menace. The smokestack additions will get a straight up black blasting to blend them into the rest of the smokestack smoke, and I'll vacillate between black smoke pouring out of the buzzsaw wound and a glowing, flaming, sparking wound instead. By not making up my mind, I managed to make it look like a failed attempt at both of them, and it makes me sad whenever I look at it, but now I'm too far into this to clean it up and try again. Finally, I can add a plume of smoke trailing from the Blue Death's head cannon, where it's launched a projectile directly through the Red Menace. Speaking of which, it's time to make said projectile, and I'm gonna go with the request of one of my Patreon patrons who said they should be fighting with cans, and I think that's a great idea. So instead of a cannonball or a rocket or a bullet, I'm gonna make a teeny tiny can of 7-Up that's been launched out of the Blue Death's head cannon. 7-Up, of course, is one of PepsiCo's vassal states, so naturally in the far-flung future of battling soda-based megacorps, 7-Up would provide their liege PepsiCo with appropriately branded armaments. Once my little can of 7-Up is finished, I can remove it from its metal handle and attach it to a little length of hooked acrylic rod that I'll hot glue into the open exit wound on the back of Red Menace's body. Finally, for the final last but not least, I need to appease the should it be leaking portion of the JunkBot generator's demands, which I'll do by mixing some silicone caulking with a little umber ink to create a goopy, bubbly mixture that is oddly reminiscent of a certain carbonated brown sugar water. I'll then slop this onto the exposed acrylic rod holding my weaponized can of 7-Up and, using a hand heavily soaked in isopropyl alcohol to keep it from sticking to the silicone, I can twist and shape it into a swirling splash of Coca-Cola that's trailing behind the green bullet launching out of Cokebot's back. And with that, I think I've just had about enough of these BattleBots, so it's time we got on to the Glamour Shots. However, before we get to those, make sure you take a look at the playlist below. These BattleBots are part of a much larger and, frankly, much more impressive collection of JunkBot-generated creations created by other far more talented content creators than myself, lovingly called the Big Bot Bash. All these fine folk rolled their own dice, made their own bots, then turned them into YouTube content for you to consume. And you should consume. If there's anything our soda pop overlords want, it's for you to consume product. So go forth and watch, and subscribe, then come back here and watch my Glamour Shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them. Happy birthday Joss, Jordan Morrow, Zort Point Narf, Eden Julian and Samuel were here, Common, Oh No Nixon, happy birthday Carrie, Mama Loves You, Viv, Abby, happy birthday Miller Von Millenstein, Eight-Legged Crow, Rebecca Moretto, Aimless Client, Ben Watts, Sarah Loves April, Matilda Webb, Timothy Nolan, Hannah Terry, Ryan Erskines, Hollow, Airbear, Road Rat, Wisdom, Narvijas Zukauskas, Trev, and I am the Lizard Queen. You are the little spindly legs that keep this big robo battle bot of a channel stomping towards world domination. Remember to check out those other videos and subscribe to the channels if you haven't already. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.